So, welcome to our third chat talk. The theme is revolution and historical social science, a conversation. Our structure for this is pretty laid back. We're actually going to have a conversation. So I'm going to hand it off to our moderator, Eric.
Hey everybody, thanks so much for being here. As Sarah said, well, and also thank you first to Sarah for organizing this and getting everything put together. It's really exciting, and I think we're all looking forward to being here. As Sarah mentioned, this is going to be fairly informal. The idea is to have a conversation both about our panelists' research and what they're working on, but also the state of the field and what's exciting, what opportunities there are for up-and-coming researchers. Our goal is to, well, get things started off with just a little bit of an introduction of everybody, give everyone on the panel a chance to talk about what they're working on lately. But then our hope is that this will be more of a conversation. So if you have questions, if there are things that you want to, or comments, ways that you want to weigh in, feel free to raise your hand or put a comment in the chat. The goal here is to have this, have some audience participation. So hopefully that will happen and we'll get things started. So I'm Eric Schoon, and I'm thrilled to be joining today our panelists, Colin Beck from Pomona College, Kistin Plys from the University of Toronto, Atef Said from the University of Illinois, Chicago, and Xiaohong Xu from the University of Michigan. Go figure that. Stumble at the end. But so I want to get things started today and ask each of our panelists to just tell us a little bit about what you're working on these days. And sorry, for order, I just listed everybody in alphabetical order by last name. So if we want to go in that order, that's great. Or we can go in reverse alphabetical order. We can take turns, maybe alphabetical this time, and then we'll swap it for the next one.
Okay, that would put me up first then, yes. So what am I working on? Well, there's kind of two things. I'm just excited because yesterday we submitted to a press, my co-authors and I, a very long book that we've been, well, the book isn't long, but the process of writing it was long, on the future of revolution theory. And that's co-authored with Mlada Bukovansky, Eric Chenoweth, George Lawson, Mlada, Daniel Ritter, and Sharon Nepstad. And so we'll be hopefully seeing that out in print in short order in the next year or so. And so that project is essentially a group of us looking at the state of revolution theory and saying, what comes next? How can we actually anticipate ways to build theory into the future and study revolutions into the future in a fruitful way? That's basically kind of been a side project for a few years. The main thing I've been doing on and off for the past decade is actually looking at knowledge accumulation and comparative methodology in the study of revolution. So I have a couple of pieces that have been published using some of this data over the years, but I am working on finishing my book on that. I'm actually updating the data through 2020 currently. So I will have 50 years of comparative studies of revolution. And then I'm kind of able to look at what do they argue, how do they select their cases, how might that affect what they find, what are the consensual findings of this approach in the field. So this, as you can imagine, is a massive undertaking, which is why I've been working on it for so very, very long. But hopefully within 2 years, I should have a book mostly done on that you can all look forward to reading.
Thank you, Kistin.
Okay, great. That was so interesting. So today, these days, the main project that I'm working on is this book about this place called Pak Tea House, which is a cafe in Lahore, Pakistan, that was for decades this really important literary and art salon, but then became a hotbed of political resistance during the 1977 military coup. And there's not been any academic work that's been done on this, and very few sources, and those sources too are only in Urdu, that even mention the activities that took place in Lahore's cafe culture during the military dictatorship. And so that's why I'm starting to write this book about the artists, poets, and leftists who are mostly Marxist or Maoist, who were regulars at this tea house. And together they created this incredibly interesting and creative avant-garde artistic movement against the military dictatorship that was mostly articulated through painting, poetry, literature, and other artistic forms. And I've been doing, this is based on archival work that I've been doing in Pakistan that's supplemented with oral histories conducted mostly in Urdu and some in Punjabi. And I came to this topic because after my first book, Brewing Resistance, which came out this past summer, it feels like a lot longer ago, was about the role of cafe culture in the movement against India's brief period of dictatorship in the 1970s. But there, the politics was much more conventional. And this history of the cafe culture during Pakistan's military coup around the same time is really interesting to me because that military dictatorship, while it was extremely repressive, the left instead decided to foment what particularly the Maoists that I've spoken with called this cultural front as a way to build a movement against the dictatorship while also evading repression because the cultural expression was kind of like vague and amorphous. And so with this work coming to fruition, the like more academic, intellectual kind of work, I've also been working with art museums and art galleries here in Toronto where I'm based, but also virtually with some art galleries in Eastern Europe around creating content in the museum space and digitally around politically engaged Global South contemporary art. And I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about that later if there's interest, but I won't talk about it much now because it's not the intellectual piece of what I'm up to right now, or academic piece, I guess.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Kistin. Atef.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for Eric and Sarah for organizing. And it's exciting to hear from Colin and Kistin and Xiaohong. So what I'm working on now, I'm finishing up my book, my first academic book. I wrote 2 activist books before that, but it's about the Egyptian Revolution of 2011. And the lens I'm looking at is the Tahrir Square's relationship to the Egyptian Revolution and how not only Tahrir Square was the primacy of Tahrir or iconization of Tahrir or the occupation piece and the larger revolutionary repertoire was an overdetermined process, but also as the revolution itself, what is identified with Tahrir and so forth. So there's many things to look at about, but I develop what I describe as a spatio-temporal analysis of revolutions, looking at why certain spaces had some primacy, revolutionary spaces, in what ways some revolutionary spaces were more important than others, what are the spatial markers, temporal markers in the revolution, and so forth, and how to think of this as a lens to many successes and failures. I know whatever that means, can talk about forever about successes and failures and revolutions. But this is that's the main project. I finished a draft. I'm revising it now. I'm very excited that part of the title is Revolution Squared. So I'm not promoting the book. Hopefully it will be out earlier next year. But briefly, as much as revolution, as we agree, revolution is determined or defined by structural analysis, conditions, class. I also argue that we can't give up the geography of the modes of actions, and we should be more attentive to revolution's spatio-temporal context. And I can elaborate on this more. 2 other pieces I'm working on is an article I finished on counter-revolution, the concept of counter-revolution. What is counter-revolution? As much as we are really invested on revolution and their temporal boundary, their cause and outcome, many discussions, but what is counter-revolution? What's a counter-action? Is it restorations? Or who are the actors and how the actors shifting their position from time to time? So I do so with the case study of the Egypt, in the Egyptian case, and I try to present what I describe as a temporally sensitive and disaggregated account of the different actors and actions in the period from 2011 to 2016. I can talk more about this. It's really fascinating how to think. And I know we have really the classic important works, the Vende and 18 Premiere and other works, but we need to look at certain cases and to really develop, go further to this under-theorized concept. The other project on a short article on revolutionary events, and in which there's lots of discussions on events and eventfulness and events history and all these amazing discussions we have in CHS, you know, but one of the things that I'm trying to argue in this paper is we still have structuralist lens to think about events. And even when we think about contingency and outcome and structural transformations or so forth, they are still historical structural lens. So I'm trying to highlight agency or different types of agencies in different moments. You know, it's the interventionist, infiltrated agency. There's lots of interesting things happening in the Egyptian case that I'll be happy to elaborate. And some of you know about the coup in 2013. Most of you, perhaps. So there's lots of things to think about agency and agency in the micro level and so forth. So these are the key things I'm working on now. I'm really excited and really interested in the future of revolutions. I'm looking forward to Colin Beck and Lawson's book. Lots of interesting discussions. It's ongoing conversation that I'm looking forward to have.
Hey, thank you so much, Atef. Xiaohong.
Okay, yes, I want to thank Sarah and Eric for organizing this conversation that I'm really excited about. Now, my main focus now is finishing my book project on the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and with a goal to understand why the Cultural Revolution sort of marked this pivotal point from revolutionary China to a post-revolutionary China that's very deeply depoliticized and economistic, right? There's total rejection of revolutionary politics in post-Mao era. Of course, you know that, and really in the Tiananmen moment, but that seed was there toward the end of the Cultural Revolution. So what I argue in the book manuscript is that that during the height of the Cultural Revolution, you know, the Maoists basically made the separation of the political and economic, and that separation had a huge consequence in. It was a success to face certain existential crisis in Shanghai with workers uprising, and the Maoists sort of make that pivot point to score a political victory while trying to stabilize crisis. And what I argue was that separation succeed in that moment, but led to you know, very disastrous political consequence, and that led to kind of popular disenchantment with revolutionary politics and certain kind of what I call popular economism that really became this boomerang effect that paved the way for this post Mao era where, you know, that revolutionary politics becomes unthinkable. So that's the book project. It's really about you know, both I use some kind of performative and eventful analysis to understand the event, but I also want to understand the position of politics and revolutionary politics, particularly in modern China. And I have two other projects that relate to cultural revolution, to revolution studies as well. I've just completed a quantitative collaborative project on the social, what I call the social geography of revolution, basically looking at 154 counties and during the revolutionary period and see which county flipped to red, and what kind of conditions that predict those the takeover by the communists. So what we find is that there's a very clear, it was really interaction between this model, the state penetration and the local elite structure that were impacted by this this state penetration, and that led to, on the one hand, this exacerbation of local governance structure, and on the other, the elite fracture in that shaped this revolutionary outcome. And I have a third part, kind of collaborative. And this is also these two projects are collaborative, and the other one is on Hong Kong, recent Hong Kong protests. That's not revolutionary in the traditional sense, but it was revolutionary in the sense of its disruptiveness and its militant repertoire. And so what I was particularly interesting is this ubiquity of family metaphors in the protest, or what they call the revolution, by the participants. And then this is, of course, family metaphors typically occur a lot in more traditionalistic or transitional kind of political context. So it is unusual and anomalous in a highly modernized place like Hong Kong. And so we find, and it's also unprecedented in the history of Hong Kong protests. So what we argue is that it has something to do with the crisis of this Hong Kong's hybrid system of neoliberal capitalism and certain kind of soft authoritarianism, the family ideals that were the family values that are being promoted by this very depoliticized neoliberal polity, but at the same time, so family metaphors serve to some extent as this political avatar of certain kind of family ideal, but at the same time, a shared criticism of the system that actually failed family as an institution for many young people in Hong Kong. And we had a lot of complexity in that, but basically what we were interested in is this interpenetration of the political and the familial, and what it means to for our understanding of crisis, of sort of certain kind of authoritarian, a combination of authoritarianism and neoliberal capitalism. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Xiaohong. These are great. I mean, it's so exciting to see what's happening right now in revolutionary studies, and in particular the scope of projects that are going on. This is really exciting. We have some questions in the chat. The first one, Sarah has been pushing me to also weigh in and jump in, and I am hesitant to, because there's a lot more interesting things happening with the panelists. I will answer the question. Right now, my current project is not focused on revolutions. I'm working on a project that looks at both the origins and consequences of generalized suspicion in Turkey. There's a lot of literature, both popular accounts, media accounts, and ethnographic accounts that talk about suspicion as a pervasive phenomenon among people in Turkey. And so I have been interviewing ethnographers who've conducted long-term fieldwork in the country over the past 30 years, and using their accounts to sort of get a record of how suspicion is, the role of suspicion in different regions of the country, different contexts, things like that, and then using that as a jumping off point for looking at sort of the political history of it. But that's what I'm working on right now. I do want to, so I'll move through the questions in order. Isaac asked, said that you have a question about the spatial turn in the study of revolutions. Do you want people to weigh in on that, or do you have a particular question that you'd like to ask about it?
I have a particular question, and I think this is directed most specifically at Atef, but the panel as a whole may want to weigh in. I'm very interested to hear more about the privileged space of Tahrir and more generally about squares and how, I mean, I'm very interested in the spatial turn, kind of. But my question is, what is the relationship between the arguments that you're developing about specific spaces and Arjuman's argument about the myth of revolution becoming a kind of like cultural feature of the modern? Because it just strikes me that in revolutionary moments, when squares are, or certain places become central, there's also a kind of citationality going to the myth of revolution, in the sense that it's hard not to feel that in revolutionary moments there are citations to Tiananmen in Tahrir, and that, you know, somewhere back behind that is Place de la Bastille or something like that. And you know, Arjuman has one very particular way of thinking about the myth of revolution, and it sounds like you have a different way. And I would just wanted to invite you to kind of elaborate a little bit more on, you know, points of disagreement and agreement with that kind of like cultural approach that you would elaborate, because I think I learn a lot from that.
Yeah. Thanks, Isaac. This is a great question. Maybe two quick answers, because really it's intriguing, and I have to think about Arjuman, that I'm thankful for the way you put it about how I distinguish myself from this cultural argument. But first, the spatial turn, in short, I don't think it made it all the way to the revolution studies, and was still like really some of the critical works, Tilly and political geographers about spaces and contention, and how claim making is spatialized and all this. It's beyond this. I don't think spatial turn didn't make it all the way, and revolution specifically is an explosion of geography and possibilities. And so we can separate the built-in environment, the physical from the symbolic, and they're really intertwined. And for a space like Tahrir, for example, you know, it was identifying the revolution. It was identified with Tahrir. And Tahrir was, in the sense, the anchor of the revolution, but at the same time, the voice of the revolution, and also marginalizing other spaces. So it's really lots of complications in the story. So in short, there's lots of possibilities to do spatial analysis of revolutions beyond GIS and quantifying, you know, where is protest happening, because there's the discursive and the physical are really intertwined. And in revolutions, you know, barricades, rallies, all these things happens in spaces, and modes of action happens in spaces. Why are certain spaces are more feasible to protest or not, but also given the new liberal conditioning of spatialities, you know, the parks are really, the public squares are really less and less, you know, accessible to the public. So there's lots of things going on. While I'm trying to attend to the dialectic relation between regime and mobilizations in certain moments, so temporalize and periodize, and to think about where are the key turning points in this dialectic relations. For Arjuman, I love that. I agree that we can't avoid this mythology, you know, or the culture, but revolution, it's impossible to separate the space and the place, just in short terms, really. Like Tahrir was physical space for hygiene and camps and tents and food and bathrooms, you know, and like, you know, and determinations and banners and all of the above. But it's also meaning and, you know, the global icon and so forth. I can elaborate more on what is the spatiotemporality in my work, but I think this is, for now, that's to be short. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Isaac.
Atef, that's great. I know this is such a great question. I think that I want to make sure that all of the panelists have a chance to speak to it. Xiaohong, you mentioned that you're doing work on the social geography of revolutions, and Kistin, I think your focus on a particular location, this very specific space, is highly relevant to this. And Colin, I know from other conversations that your project on looking at how we've studied revolutions looks at, you know, how cases are selected and clustered, and so please others weigh in.
I can, yeah, since you called me. So yeah, so I guess the spatial term for me has to be like, you know, paying attention both to the center as well as to the local, right? I think that, you know, my social geography of the Chinese Revolution was mainly kind of looking at it, the spatial variation, you know, how local dynamics work. It's very different from, let's say, the center of national political attention, like, you know, Tahrir Square or Tiananmen Square. And I think they have certain, you know, in the revolutionary process, there's certain sort of mutual, I guess, influence between these two. You know, how national politics kind of feed into local politics, how local politics also can create some narrative, maybe some narrative emerge from local politics that can project on the national stage. And so, for example, you know, in Hong Kong's recent protests, there is this almost utopian vision of like, we want one day. So there's this place they call it Bao Day. Bao Day is the area outside of the legislative council where they, you know, they storm legislative council, and that's because they had to put a mask to hide their identity in fear of political persecution. So that we want one day we can gather there, take off our masks, and that's a utopian vision, right? But at the same time, that movement was spread across the city, and that local dynamics all create back to that area, that Baodi narrative. So I think that's two, you know, different aspects of revolutionary politics from my own perspective.
Like,
yeah, please, Kristen and Colin. Kristen, go ahead.
Sure. No, so you know, I'm really thrilled that this is the question that we're starting from, because you know, I know that there has been the spatial turn that's taken over much of sociology very broadly, but I think that in CHS and historical sociology more broadly, space has always been there if it hasn't been sort of like articulated as such. And so the way that I like to think about space in my work, like, first of all, the space of the cafe is really important in my first book and in this book that I'm working on right now, as this sort of like incubator of various movements against the state. But I also think that as historical sociologists, you know, I'm a good Wallersteinian, and so we can't really think about time without thinking about space. And so just like there are these different sort of like unit of analyses and thinking about the way that time is broken up and constructed in historical social science research into the episodic, the cyclical, the structural, the infinite, so too, like, does space have these corresponding you know, dimensions that map on to those different social constructions of time. So here we can think about the geopolitical, as Xiaohong brought up, but also the ideological, and then sort of these east-west dichotomies, or north-south, if you want to call it that, or whatever. And then also sort of the concept of structural space. So I think that, you know, in my work, I really try to grapple with the ways in which, particularly in the legacies of the cafe culture, which is this really fraught space, particularly in the global South context that I'm focusing on, that like time and space kind of operates together to create this sort of like really profound event that's sort of this opening up of both time and space in order to create these real possibilities. So I think that that's a very central question that I hope that other folks can chime in on, because I think this is really important for us to talk about.
Thank you so much, Colin.
Yeah, I'll just agree with everything everyone has said. But also, I think there's I have two reactions to the idea of space. One is the idea of how repertoires have shifted, as Atef is looking at. If, you know, Nadir Sohrabi's work back in the 90s on different models of revolution, I think really hasn't been absorbed as much or paid as much attention as it should. But if you really think about it, there is the model of the French Revolution, the Enlightenment revolutions, which kind of dominates the 19th century, and then the model of the kind of violent vanguard party socialist from the Russian Revolution, which dominates most of the 20th century. And what we see today is a completely different model. And it goes, we call it different things because it's relatively new, right? Like people power, unarmed resistance, civil resistance, nonviolence, et cetera. But intrinsic to this model is space, is the occupation of public space. in a way that was not the case, right, say for the communist revolutions. So I find that like a really fascinating thing to think about as intrinsic to what is going on with revolution currently. The other thing I think about is kind of more what Kristin was talking about, space as a metaphor in some ways. Back when I was writing my dissertation, was started at 15 years ago, I was really struck by the idea of revolution as liminality. We know that movements and revolutionary organizations emerge in liminal spaces, physical spaces, right? And we call them various things, free spaces or interstitial nodes, whatever. But like you need a free space to organize, be it a cafe or a church or what have you. But then the revolution itself, the revolutionary event, is very much a liminal moment when new possibilities can be articulated and imagined, as Atef was saying. And I think that's well represented in Ivan Ermakov's work in some ways of like the liminal, like just potential that exists in these unruly times where normal routines break down. And I think that's something that's really interesting and we don't pay enough attention to. And I'd love to see much more work on it.
This is great question. Thank you, Isaac. It's really generative. I think there's a lot to talk about here. We have fantastic questions in the chat, and I'm going to try to combine a couple of them because there's conversation in the chat and dialogue with the questions, which is fantastic. So Richard asked whether it's fair to characterize the current state of the field of revolutionary studies as focused primarily on processes of revolutions, with less attention to causes and even less attention to the consequences of revolutions. And Rebecca, you may also weighed in emphasizing the importance of looking at both of these elements. And Adam Slez, I'm not going to include everything that was in response to this, so I'll try to chunk things up a little bit, but Adam pointed out the similarity between Richard's question and recent accounts of the evolution of the literature on contentious politics. And so I want to give the panelists a chance to weigh in on, first, is this a fair characterization? The current state of the field is really much more focused on processes than outcomes or consequences. And the extent to which that is a productive turn, if that is the turn, if you agree or not. And also if you want to weigh in and build this in about the relationship between work on revolutions and social movements and how those are kind of coming together.
I'm going to do an order.
You know what? We're just going to dive in. Let's go. Whoever unmutes first, it's going to be a quick draw response.
I will go. So I think this is a great question. I appreciate Richard and Rebecca's. This is I think it's a fair characterization. However, I agree with Rebecca's that really we can't give up causalities and outcomes, but we need to problematize what outcomes. And given all this simplistic, perhaps binary about political and social revolutions in the uncertain, fluid global capitalist moment, we have to really think thoroughly about outcomes and processes. Without whatever that means, because we can go discuss forever what is processes, what's the revolutionary process, and I really don't have simple answer to this, but it doesn't go against outcome. And also, even though I'm somehow was tired of thinking about causes and outcomes in my work, and it's overwhelming obsession with causes and outcomes, given positivists, whatever legacy or impact or positivist hunting in how we think still. But we can't give up causalities. But we need to remember some simple lessons in revolution theory about how to think temporally in a thick way about causalities, about the immediate causes, the triggers, the perceptance, the deeper conditions. Sometimes we overlook this because we have like some formulas about state breakdown, or like really sometimes even though we say historical, they are presentist. They are not really deployed in a thicker way, just to say the least. But I appreciate the question a lot.
Thanks, Atef. Others?
I think it's right to say that most of what you see on Revolution these days is focused on process rather than kind of distal causation or even immediate outcome. And I actually think the action should be on outcomes, right? So there's this old kind of mid-late 20th century tradition in the modernization and the Marxist literatures of looking at the long-term outcomes of revolution, but it was really only in a structural fashion. And I would actually like to see a lot more work, this is free research idea, just follow a revolution, a case or two cases, see what happens to the participants in the wake of it. See what happens to societies, economic structures, regimes, not just like kind of grand, is this a social revolution, but on a really more micro and meso level to kind of trace the outcomes of a revolution for a long period of time. But yeah, the field is basically really focused on process. I think that's in some ways a reaction to the sense that kind of the structural causation a la Scotchpole or Jack Goldstone, that has run its course. People aren't finding new things there. So there's like much more on the event itself, on the unfolding of events, rather than kind of what ultimately caused it, or what are the underlying conditions. And that's exactly, as Adam points out, that's exactly what has happened in the study of social movements too.
I could.
Kistin, Xiaohong, go ahead, Kistin.
I can get in on this. So I think that this is also like a really great question to think through, and accurate, that there is this tendency to focus more on process rather than cause. I think, there is, at least in my characterization, and I think a lot in my work, about what comes after. And I don't know if that's, as Colin said, it might not neatly map on to these ideas of cause and consequence, or, cause and outcome. But what is left in the wake of these profound moments of social upheaval, I think, is being addressed and discussed in some way, but it might not look, as Colin said, the way that it has looked in the past. And I think that, like the other thing I think that we should bring into this are sort of, there's been a lot of discussion, I think, among the panelists and the audience around this question of the event. And I do think theoretically, like that is also the emphasis, and why like there is this shift in sort of the language through which we talk about revolution. And so I think a lot of the same elements are there. But in, this turn to focus on the event as this like multiplicity that has potential for change, it generates a different kind of theory building too. And I think that that's also why there's this shift, although there are these, I think, more maybe careful or cautious ways of thinking about what comes after, to put it in those terms. But I think attendant to that, I think, Colin, you brought up Theda Skocpol's work. I do think that while maybe the content of the work, like the academic intellectual content, is maybe something that contemporary researchers are distancing themselves from, like I see among younger scholars, but also particularly among my PhD students, this leaning into sort of the political praxis of that earlier work in an interesting way, combining it with theories of the event. So that I think that there is also, with this focus on process, there is this really interesting return towards thinking about revolution because that there's this pressing need in the contemporary conjuncture for significant social change, and that through investigating these ruptures, there's this way to think once again about the way that contemporary movements can learn from the past.
Thank you. So I think this is a great characterization. Like my take is that I think the processual turn has produced a lot of interesting works, but I take it more as, I think, more like a methodological stance than I guess, I mean, of course, there are theoretical kind of payoffs to that, but I think, that methodological stance should be harnessed for the kind of question that we really want to ask. So, and a lot of them that we have to kind of, look at the consequences and the impacts to build on that question. And my own work on the Cultural Revolution for me is really to address this precedent question, the demise of revolutionary politics, while the Cultural Revolution leads to this, this disenchantment of politics, even politics per se. In China, this is like hegemonic ideology that's parallel to neoliberalism, but you can use a different way to characterize it. And it's really impactful in terms of how China is integrated into global capitalism, how it can be a hegemonic, power. And I think that's a question. And for me, that processual perspective is useful to understand why it came about, but the question has to be really like based on a deep understanding of and concern with some of the consequences that revolution has created. And I also feel like that in terms of the courses, there's also a lot to be salvaged. I think one way, like the project that I just finished, was based on the idea that one way to look at the and that's really like about structural kind of local structural dynamics that shape the communist revolution. It's based on the idea that we can look at local variations to identify those structural conditions. And I think that's a fruitful way to look at and to understand why the communist, so certain county flip to red, that's a and I was able to kind of address a lot of traditional kind of structuralist explanation. Some of which I find not more problematic. Other I felt like there are parts that we can sort of refine, particularly in terms of how state-centric theory should be combined with this kind of elite fracturing, elite resettlement, I guess, perspective. So yeah, and that dynamic sometimes can be different from the kind of national political dynamics. I have in my analysis, I find sometimes certain causes that are very crucial in national politics has almost no impact. They're not significant in explaining any local like variation, and that kind of circle back to this question of spatial term as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all so much. So we have a lot of questions. I want to briefly just, Mugigo Chek had raised her hand and wants to specifically speak to these questions. So I'm going to invite you to speak and ask your question or make your comment, and then I'll continue to try to cluster questions and build on this conversation, because it looks like we have a lot of great comments and questions to work in response to this. So please go ahead.
Thank you so much. This is wonderful. I'm thrilled to see these discussions, and we have put, the COVID to good use. Bringing us together as a community and to discuss these things. So I think we have to also think about how the social media generates meaning in new ways of meaning that was not possible before. The virtual community obviously makes a big difference. But I wanted to actually pick upon Kistin's, how I'm very interested in who is left out of revolutions. I mean, so that brings not only the processes and the outcomes, but selectivity with respect to origins. And I know Atef has done some work on this. I mean, I think it is very important, especially if you look at things from the vantage point of minorities, to see who becomes marginalized through revolutions and who does not participate in revolution. I mean, I think that is a question to ask, which I don't think we have done enough. And the reason I point that out is I think we can get to that through the spatial analysis in ways that we cannot, especially as Kistin said, if you take that space across time and across space, of course, I mean, you know, different contexts, you have a very different perception. But the other issue with respect to meaning, I think what is new is emotions and feelings, things that are not measurable. How do you bring that in? Because emotions, as you know, Gustave Le Bon and later, play a very significant role as triggers during revolutions. And that is something I think we could bring in what it hasn't been brought in. So I was thinking whether you would, and I saw that it was also in the questions, how you would look at the Capitol raid on January 6th, because I think it would be very interesting to look at it as a failed revolution, maybe, and see how we approach it. And that also brings another context. That is the vantage point of the scholar. This is something, of course, feminist scholarship works on a lot. And I realized the significance of experience when the Capitol raid happened, because in Turkey, I've been through 6 coups. I have an experience on how these things work. So I can see patterns that Americans had no clue about. And I thought that was very interesting as to where we stand with respect to our own experiences with revolution. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think these 2 points about both emotions and about who's included tie into other people's, some other questions that we've had. For instance, Jeff Goodwin raised the question about how and when do revolutions enhance collective power of ordinary people, and when they how and when have they subjected ordinary people to new forms of oppression? And Jen Triplett followed up and asked about this, about which social groups get articulated or incorporated into the revolution, who's included in this process. So I think in asking the panelists to weigh in, I'd like to combine these, because this is an important point about who's included, who's left out, how do we make sense of this in the revolutionary process. And on the point of emotions, I think that this also ties in nicely with questions raised by Samuel Stabler about the role of utopian visions and thinking about how they animate revolutionary politics, but also Elise's comment about and question about how participation both shapes and changes participants' understandings of themselves, of what they're doing and why they're doing it in this process, and kind of an eventful understanding of self through the revolution. So I want to kind of, we'll take each of these in turn, if you want to weigh in on sort of who's included and how these fit together, and then we'll go to these broader questions about emotion.
I have a lot of thoughts on this point, if I could jump in. So thank you so much, everyone, for all of those provocations. This is really exciting to talk about this, because these are things that I've thought a lot about in my various projects. And so, you know, it brings up a couple of things for me. So first of all, you know, there's been a focus within my work, both in the first book and now, like, more so in this project, on the role of art and poetry during that moment. And a lot of, like, in interviewing people who were leftists and involved in contentious politics before the moment of revolution, and then shifting into or leaning into further the arts, it was really because of an emotional response. And so, and, you know, to go to this question of collective power as well, that there was this need to communicate what it felt like to live in this horribly oppressive regime. And so, like, through poetry or through visual arts, it was a way of, like, sharing that emotion of life in that very repressive moment. And, you know, it was interesting to me too, you know, on this question of meaning and emotions, that for my first book, Brewing Resistance, when I was doing oral history interviews with mostly leftist men, but then also some right-wing men as well, who led the movement against India's emergency in the 1970s, I tried to end the oral history interviews with this very open-ended question of, you know, what do you think the legacy of your participation in this movement was? And I was thinking that they would talk about politics, or, you know, about, you know, maybe, you know, other things, but almost every one of them said to me, well, you know, because I got so sucked in, like I never found love. And it was really interesting to me that all of these men who had never gotten, for most of them had never gotten married. I think there were only one or two of the 20 or so men that I did oral histories with, like they never found lifelong love. And so they complained. And, you know, when I started to get into it, I realized that, well, I mean, the problem was the misogyny in these movements. And there weren't women participating in the cafe culture. And so then they weren't meeting women. And it just like, it never clicked for them. And so I think that that speaks directly to this question of meaning and emotions. And then also this question of like, consequences or sort of what happens after. But when, you know, I mean, there were very, very real consequences that had like decade-long effects on these men that because the movements left out women. And so I did end up writing like a short article about it, like a very short think piece. If anyone's interested, it's in Jamhur, this like lefty magazine. But I think that, you know, one of the interesting things that I've been trying to explore is the way that through the cafe culture, there are these artistic movements that allow for expressions of different emotions related to sort of the kind of feeling of repression in these moments. But then also like there's this really interesting kind of like dialectical relationship between art and also sort of life in the cafe, that in these really repressive moments, there's also these ways that movement participants find of expressing like the vibrancy of life. And, you know, in the Pakistan case, there are more instances that I'm looking in my current work of people who found love in the cafe culture. And that's something I want to think about a little bit more. But I think that's all there. And it's something that clearly in earlier waves of sociology, historical sociology and revolutions was not explored very much. So very exciting stuff.
Thank you so much. Others?
I can go ahead. Yeah. I want to talk first about this marginalization question, and I know I'll come back to the emotions piece. The marginalization is really fascinating story. It's really even within revolutions, and maybe because of the ethnography was a privilege to me to just to be able to observe. So I found many layers of the marginalization even within the revolutionary community. There's some certain voices were louder because of the, you know, obsession, global obsession with the middle class kids with iPhones. So that's the middle class voices were more powerful or visible in Tahrir Square vis-a-vis other voices. But there's also other layers of marginalizations, that voices outside Tahrir and working class strikes were not picked up in the media compared to Tahrir and other cities and so forth. So there's lots of layers of the marginalizations. Class is important, also even gender within Tahrir. There's lots of interesting things where women were in the front lines, but in the media or even in revolutionary voices were not talking about the women as in the front lines and so forth, and some gender division of labor within Tahrir. But in short, one of the big paradoxes in revolutions is that contemporary revolutions are more and more cross-class based. So that's really and coalition based. And that's really, it's a powerful story in revolutions, but at the same time, it's a central story in their weaknesses. So just to say the least. And coalitions by definition means watering down demands or trying to seek consensus and so forth. So it's in some sense, it is coalitions gives power, but lead to marginalizing radical voices, or, you know, mainstream voices would be more upfront or more heard, such as in the case of Tahrir revolution or Egyptian, that the demands were centered around ousting the dictator. That's it. So it's a social economic justice, you know, more gender equality, and other like radical voices were not at the center or more visible and so forth. Emotions is really important story, of course, and ethnographically speaking, it's it's incredible to see how emotion shifts from time to time when the critical mass is there, critical mass is less, you know, and how these like how with the unfolding roller coasters of ongoing battle with the counter revolutions. So really, it's important to be temporally sensitive to how these issues play out, like during battles where dual sovereignty happening or multiple sovereignties. These are really critical issues where bravery and determinations and martyrdom and all these things play out in more determinations and so forth, or dialectics of fear and hope and so forth, just to say the least. It's a really fascinating lens, and we need to really develop more and be sensitive to how emotions shifts. Moge also asked about virtual digital spaces. I don't want to go there because it's really can of worms, and it's, but in short, as sociologists who are good historical sociologists, really we need to be attentive to the shifts, like the Green Movement or Zapatistas or all these things. And post-Arab Spring is different from the pre-Arab Spring. And Facebook is intervening in lots of things in contemporary politics. So really digital spaces are not linear, they are contradictory, and then they're intertwined with capital and censorship and repression, and it's a complicated stories, just to say the least. So in short, I love to be like, take a good balance between the techno-pessimistic, techno-optimistic, like things are fluid and contradictory, but of course we have to take it seriously into account, technology and in revolutions.
Thank you so much, Atef. Sarah just sent a message reminding us that we need to wind down, but there's so many great questions that we haven't had a chance to address. So I'm going to do my best to do one Mondo combination question, but it's going to be a lightning round to keep things in time. And Colin and Xiaohong, since you didn't have a chance to start with the last one, or to weigh in on the last question, I'm going to start with the two of you, but we're going to keep our answers to a minute, which probably means more than a minute, but keep it to a minute as a big sort of final lightning round to wind this down. So there are a couple of questions that came up, and this relates to Muge's question about the Capitol riots and how we see this fitting in, and Orloff asked a question about the relationship between studying revolutions and other elements of the cultural or social revolutions like civil rights, feminism, etc., directed at overthrow. And we've had, sorry, I lost my other question. And how we can kind of make sense of these things in conjunction, and potentially to weave in Ali's question, learn from other disciplines about this. So we'll take a minute if each of you wants to just weigh in quickly on your thoughts about, you know, how we can apply our insights to current events, how this fits together, and what insights we might want to draw from outside the discipline of sociology. And let's go Colin, and then Xiaohong, and then Kistin and Atef.
Okay, in 1 minute, I'm going to take a contrary position. I don't think revolutions as they are currently practiced are a good vehicle for utopianism. As Atef was saying, they are self-limiting. They have moderation as a curse. And that is a product of their era as well as their mobilizing strategies. When we look at what has happened with the Trump administration, I think we can certainly think about that and others, Hungary, India, Turkey, as revolutionary illiberalism. And I think we actually need to spend a lot more time studying illiberalism as a feature of modernity, as a feature of revolution that we haven't paid much attention to. In essence, these are revolutions from above. However, I will not agree that the Capitol riot was a revolutionary moment. To me, that looked like farcical theater. It's interesting. It was, in many ways, I think there's a great paper to be written that I hope to write, but if anyone else wants to do it, you should do it first, on comparing the Capitol riot to the taking of the Bastille, where essentially no one knows what they're doing and they mill around, right? They're doing it based on disinformation and attacking a stronghold of government, but they really have no plan as to what they're going to do once they get there and what they're going to do after. And it's actually leaderships who aren't there who then use that as a moment to press their revolutionary program. And what is lacking in the US in 2020 and 2021 is a leadership with a revolutionary program. The former guy, we all know, was not very good at articulating plans nor carrying them out. So I will leave it there with the contrary position. Revolutions are not vehicles for utopianism, nor was the Trump administration a political revolution, nor could it be.
Thank you so much. Xiaohong.
Thank you all for all these great questions. I really feel like we should have, a day to address them. But I just for the sake of time, I'll be very condensed in addressing. I think the big question that I think is here. I think we should theorize the relationship and also the tension between the revolutionary and the political. Now, the revolutionary is an extreme form of the political because it involves certain use of violence, and it's very different from, it could be the state violence, but it could also be a certain kind of symbolic violent breakthrough to unsettle that state violence, right? So that's a element in revolutionary, and it's different from, let's say, the political that, for example, we would want more political articulation about gender dynamics, the tension between, the public and private, the class issue. But these are, in the exigency moment of the revolutionary, oftentimes there's a lot of tension with that. So I think, my take is that looking at, for example, our sisters, I guess, subdiscipline, the economic sociology, there are a lot of generative conversation going on, thinking about what they are against, which is this market fundamentalism. And so how is economic, kind of entangled with the social. And I think in revolution studies, we should really think about what we are against. We are against, for example, of course, oppression, authoritarianism, a certain kind of death of the political, and I think we should take that kind of to really theorize about the revolutionary and how it's different from, or what's the relationship it has with the political and the social. Yeah, so I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Xiaohong. Kistin.
Great. So I'm going to take up this really interesting prompt to that the study of revolutions right now is not directed at overthrow. And I think that that's something that mirrors what's happening in social movements and revolutions today, where increasingly we see political action that's not directed at the state. Broadly speaking. And so I think that as historical sociologists, though, it gives us an opportunity to play around with the unit of analysis and be creative in rethinking the unit of analysis of revolutions. And at least in my work, I've tried to think about this by going a unit analysis above the state and thinking about particularly the way that, the movements that I'm looking at are doing world historical ideology making on a global scale. And then way below the unit of analysis of the state to think about these small autonomous spaces, in my case, in the cafe culture, that are really trying to envision what constructing a society could look like outside of state and capital, and then doing so on this very, very small scale with a lot of tensions and problems and issues. But I think that, that there's something really interesting when we get away from this question of overthrow, and I think it allows for this incredible kind of creativity, both epistemologically and in terms of the content that we're looking at.
Thank you so much, Kistin. And our final comment from Atef Said.
Yeah, thanks, Eric, and thanks all. This is at the heart of what thinking about future of revolutions. I can't separate really the overthrowing, because that's, from my case, for example, it's the deadliest mistake for Egyptian revolutionaries and many Arab Spring revolutions, that you're not interested in overthrowing the state. You have this confusion or this vague idea about downfall of the regime and so forth. But in short, about this, I lost my thread. I want to go back to the utopia, and the other comment was when
just 1 minute on how this fits in with the question about
the capital right. Yeah, I mean,
current
this,
political revolution, overthrow.
no, the capital right is really intriguing example, and I agree with Colin's comments. But however, it's a really great example as a reminder for us to think about. There is lots of confusion about the meaning of revolution today and the future, and the revolution as a concept is being tarnished. The reputation of the concept, really, we're thinking about those folks who are storming the Capitol, talking about revolutions, regardless how they don't fit our categories, but they believe this is a revolution, right? And there's a global, there's lots of confusion about this idea that democracies are immune from revolutions. Like there's no the global democracies and really well-established democracies are neoliberal authoritarian regimes in some sense, or the authoritarian democracies. So really, we need to rethink our categories. I'm not saying we can save the reputation of the concept, as scholars. Maybe I will leave this to revolutionaries themselves, right? But we need to clarify some of these confusions, save the category. Maybe some point of disagreement with Colin and about the utopia. It's still there, but we can't, because even utopia is being appropriated by, there's supremacist utopias. There's many other utopias, fundamentalist utopias, Salafist utopias, jihadist utopias. Which utopias are we talking about? And in revolution, we can't give up utopia. It's part of the idea of liberation, emancipations, or whatever, or practicing autonomous zones on the ground. There is always some ideas of utopia. So that's in short.
Thank you so much. I gave you all the impossible task of 1 minute, and I have to admit that this was exactly what I was hoping for, which was a quick response. I want to thank all of our panelists for a wonderful discussion and all of our participants for a wonderful discussion. This was so engaging and thought-provoking. I also make an apology to absolutely everyone for so inelegantly trying to clump all of these questions together, but I just wanted to make sure that we got to as many as we could. So I apologize, but hopefully, I think that this is such a generative discussion. I'll talk, maybe the panelists can all discuss other opportunities, but for the time being, thank you so much. Please stick around for the chat business meeting after this, and thank you again to our panelists. Wonderful job.
Thanks, Eric.